Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. This doesn't seem to be very good. Oh, maybe it's muted. Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Test. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, we begin with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, today we will be taking Sutta number 26 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is called the Ariyapariyesana Sutta, which means the noble search. And this is a story about the Buddha's own quest for enlightenment. And so I will weave together this sutta together with passages from another sutta, number 36, which also deals with the story of the Buddha's quest for enlightenment. And generally within the oldest discourses, the Nikayas, we don't find an interest in the biography of the Buddha so much for the purpose of recording biographical facts. Is that thing working?
We got it.
Okay, so we don't find an interest in the life of the Buddha from the standpoint of recording biographical facts, but certain stories about the Buddha's quest for enlightenment and his activities are given in a way to set up, you might call this a kind of paradigm or a model for, it serves as an example or model for followers of the Buddha's path. So we could say that the life of the Buddha serves as a supreme example, the supreme model of a life which is dedicated to enlightenment, to realization. Okay, so the sutta begins one time when the Buddha was living in the town of Savatthi, and then there was a group of monks who apparently they might have come from elsewhere because they say that they had not heard, for a long time they had not heard a discourse from the Buddha himself. And so they go to the Buddha's attendant, Venerable Ananda, and ask whether they could have that privilege of hearing the Buddha give a discourse. And then Ananda indicates to these monks, he says, you should go to the hermitage of a Brahmin named Ramaka. And then he says, perhaps you will get to hear a discourse from the Blessed One's own lips. In other words, Ananda is giving them a kind of hint that he is going to take the steps in requesting the Buddha to give a discourse for the sake of those monks. Okay, so then in the evening, or the afternoon, the Buddha and Ananda, they go to another place in Savatthi called the Eastern Park. They spend the day there. And then in the evening, when they get up from their meditation, they go to a place, to the bathing place. Then after their bath, the Venerable Ananda says to the Buddha, in effect he says, let's go to the hermitage of the Brahmin Ramaka. And he praises this place in a way to try to persuade the Buddha to go there. The Buddha agrees by silence, and then they go to the hermitage of this Brahmin. And now when they arrive, then these monks are sitting in the hermitage. They've already gone there, and so they're discussing the Dhamma. Then the Buddha enters, and then he asks, what is the discussion that you were engaged in just now? And then the monks say that our discussion was about the Buddha himself. Okay, then the Buddha says, good monks, then he makes an important statement. He says, it is fitting for you, young men who have gone forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness, to sit together to discuss the Dharma. When you gather together, you should do either of two things. You should hold discussion on the Dhamma or maintain noble silence. 掌权法师现在在哪里？你们要告诉他，今天上课你睡怎么样？我们睡，我们要一起来，要两个东西要做一个，我们要说法，还是或是要模仿，对不对？我想他说话太多。Okay, so when you sit together, you should do either of two things. Either hold discussion on the Dhamma, or else maintain noble silence. Very important instructions, because in monastic circles these days there's a tendency not to pay much attention to that. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to come into the main part of the discourse. He speaks about two kinds of searches, or we say two kinds of quests. Here, the Pali word that's used is the word that comes, it's the title of the sutta. The word is Pariyesana, which means seeking, questing. And so the two kinds of search are called the noble search and the ignoble search. And so the noble search is Ariyapariyesana, and the ignoble search is Anariyapariyesana. Okay, so these are like the Buddha's here setting up like two aims, two aspirations for people. So first he takes the ignoble search. What is the ignoble search? Okay, someone who is himself subject to birth seeks what is subject to birth being himself subject to aging, seeks what is also subject to aging, being subject to sickness, to death, to sorrow, to defilement. He seeks what is also subject to defilement. Okay, so here I think 6 things are set up. You say 6 imperfections, being subject to birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement or corruption. And so the ignoble quest is to have one's whole life center around acquiring more and more of these things that are marked by these 6 characteristics. And so then the Buddha raises the question, what is it that is subject to birth, aging, sickness, death, and so on? Okay, then he mentions in terms of the types of objects that were sought after in this particular period of Indian history. We can make appropriate substitutions to apply it to today. Okay, so what is subject to birth and so on? Okay, sorry, this is not so fashionable, but wife and children are subject to birth. Okay, for women you could say husband and children subject to birth. Men and women slaves. Okay, in India at that time was a slave-holding society. Goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses and mares, gold and silver are subject to birth. Okay, what would we say today? People don't go around, unless they're farmers, collecting goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses and mares.
Cars.
Automobiles.
iPods.
Excuse me?
iPods.
iPods, yeah. Somebody gave me an iPod about 2 weeks ago. I looked at it and thought, too complicated. iPod, what else?
Stocks, bonds, securities.
Yeah, exactly. Stocks,
Cayman Islands, yeah, that's what you want.
stocks, bonds, securities.
Yes, accounts in Switzerland, Cayman Islands.
Accounts in Switzerland.
Yeah,
Cayman, what are Cayman Islands?
Caymans are better.
The-
Or
Cayman-
you can't see them. They're like secret accounts.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
How do you get one?
Very wealthy.
You have to be very wealthy.
State legislatures.
Okay, so stocks, bonds, assets, credit defaults, is that mortgages. Yeah. Okay, so there are many things that people want boats now, private, their own little boats, yachts.
Plastic surgery, Botox.
See that?
Is it plastic surgery? You know, Botox, that you can do that.
Yeah, plastic surgery.
100-year-old eggs. 100-year-old eggs.
100-year-old eggs.
It's a delicacy.
Oh, really? Never heard of it before. Fine wines and liqueurs, yeah. Caviar. Okay, then he uses very important words for understanding the early text. These acquisitions are subject to birth. The word in Pali, it's very difficult to translate adequately into English. Yeah, this word is upadi, which it's based on a root da, which means to place, and the prefix upa sometimes has the sense of near. So upadi would be literally things that are placed near oneself. And so it comes to take on the meaning of things that one acquires, things one possesses. We might even translate, in fact, more recently I've been translating the word as assets, things that one takes upon oneself and acquires possession over. And then this word comes to be used in different ways in different contexts, so that the word upadi can mean, on the one hand, it can mean material possessions. It can also mean the things that constitute our own being, which are the five aggregates. The five aggregates are called upadi, because those are the things that one takes upon oneself, one's most intimate possessions. And then the word upadi also comes to mean the act of taking possession. So you could say it's the act of acquisition. So it has this sort of double meaning. On the one hand, it's the things that one takes possession of, the objects of acquisition, the objects of attachment, and also it is the act of acquisition, the act of claiming possession. And then we find in the text there's a word based on upadi, it's the negation of it, nirupadi, which I wrote on the board. And this means without acquisitions, or free from acquisitions. And this word is used as a synonym for nirvana. So nirvana is nirupadi, because one who has attained nirvana doesn't take possession of anything, doesn't claim possession over anything. And we could say inwardly this person has cast off all acquisitions, the act of acquiring things. Okay, so these are the acquisitions that the Buddha is speaking of. And then the Buddha says, one who is tied to these things, we could say addicted to these things, tied to these things, infatuated with them, then here I would maybe change this to and addicted to them, being himself subject to birth, seeks what is also subject to birth. Okay, so we have all of these possessions, prized possessions, assets, things that one acquires. When one becomes attached to these things and one can't live without them and one continuously is seeking them, that is what binds one to continued birth. And so one is subject to birth, one seeks what is subject to birth, and because of that, one undergoes birth again and again. And the same thing is repeated in regard to what is subject to aging, sickness, death, sorrow, except some things are excluded from sorrow, gold and silver, is excluded from sorrow because the money doesn't weep. And then subject to defilement. Okay, so that all is considered the ignoble search. And we have to understand also, in the Buddha's time, society, culture had been undergoing very rapid and drastic changes. It was changing from a very quiet, structured agricultural society into an urban society. Towns were growing and expanding, developing into cities. The people who had been previously low in the social system, the Vaishyas, the merchants, the farmers, were now rising up because they were developing their businesses and they were becoming wealthy landowners, wealthy businessmen. And so society was in a state of flux, commotion, change, and this kind of what we call today materialism was spreading out through the whole culture, just almost the way it is today. So we should imagine that ancient Indian culture was always a very deeply religious and spiritual culture, but there was a kind of growing materialism that was spreading and changing the whole face of society. And the Buddha would have observed this. Probably it was one of the spurs that induced him to leave the worldly life and become a spiritual seeker. Okay, so that is the ignoble search. And now the Buddha is going to contrast that with the noble search. Here I come to paragraph 12. So what is the noble search? Here, someone being himself subject to birth, having understood the danger or the drawback, the defect in what is subject to birth, seeks the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Okay, here we have another important term in this sentence. The word is it's the Pali word that's translated danger. This is the word adinava. Okay, this word adinava, you say, has the sense of the defect, the deficiency, the shortcomings, the drawbacks, the wretchedness, the misery, the disadvantage. All of these are just implications of this word adinava. And so, what serves as the spur, the goad, the inducement to enter upon the life of spiritual seeking, the life of renunciation, the quest for liberation, is understanding the danger and defects in things that are subject to birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and corruption or defilement. And so when one understands this, then he seeks not the things that are subject to decay, but he turns his mind to seek that which is not subject to birth, and that's called Anuttara Yoga Kema, which means the supreme or unsurpassed security from bondage. The word yoga here, it's the same word that eventually came to be applied to these physical exercises that we now call yoga. But the original sense of the word yoga was, on the one hand, it meant exertion, effort. And the Buddha actually praises yoga in this sense. He always says, yogo karaniyo, that an exertion should be made. One should strive vigorously. But the word yoga, it's also like the English word yoke. The word yoke means something which confines one or binds one. And so yoga, in this sense, is a bond. And then the goal is yoga kema, to be free from the bonds, to be released from the bonds. And so that is what is called yoga kema, the security from bondage. And then even when one releases the cattle from their yokes, probably that's the original sense of yoga kema. The cattle, the farmer is using the oxen, to plow the field, so he puts a yoke over them. Then when he removes the yoke, the oxen reach a state called yoga kema. They're released from the yoke, released from the bond. But the Buddha speaks about anuttara yoga kema, the supreme security from bondage. And that is nirvana, which is said to be unborn, unproduced, unarisen. And similarly, one who is subject to aging understands the danger in what is subject to aging. So he seeks, again, nibbana, which is free from aging. Again, it's free from sickness, it's the deathless, it's the sorrowless, and it is the undefiled supreme security from bondage. So that is called the noble search. Okay, at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions based on what I've covered so far. Okay, I see Matt.
The only question I have is why Ananda didn't directly ask Buddha to come to the hall where the other bhikkhus were abiding, waiting for him. He sort of brought there by subterfuge in a way.
Yeah, I don't know actually.
That's
I don't know the reason. Any other questions? Okay, please, yeah.
Sorry, I just had a thought. Maybe that was Ananda's way, because sometimes Ananda could make the Buddha do things Buddha didn't want to do, usually out of kindness for other people.
Yeah.
He was very respectful of the Buddha, but he could also, in his own way, kind of be like, what about this? What about this? What about this? So
Yeah.
you get that sense.
Maybe sort of it doesn't seem that Ananda is giving orders to the Buddha.
I mean, sometimes he's direct, but sometimes he just, if he wants something done, he gets it. That's what I've noticed.
Yeah.
later in the sutta, there's a section where the Buddha says, I'm giving up, I'm being passive, I'm not doing anything direct, and maybe this is a parallel to that, where the Buddha is being sort of passive, allowing this to happen rather than...
We'll see, I'm not so sure. Okay, anyway, let us go on. There's a question from the internet, but it's about rather technical, about usage of Pali words, so I don't want to go into it now. Okay, so now the Buddha has set up this contrast between the two kinds of quests, the ignoble quest and the noble quest. And now the Buddha is going to relate this to his own life story, which is interesting here because you see the Buddha is setting up first the contrast between these two types of, these two types of orientation in life. And then the Buddha is going to show that he understands this from his own experience, that it's not something like he is a pious preacher sitting up on the platform giving a lecture on something he hasn't experienced himself, but he's going to show how he has learned this through his own hard life experience. Okay, so the Buddha says, before my enlightenment, while I was still only a bodhisattva, not yet enlightened, I too, being myself subject to birth, sought what is also subject to birth. And so is what is subject to aging, sickness, death, sorrow, defilement, and so on. So the Buddha, maybe the story about him being an actual prince, it's legendary because the Sakya state was not a kingdom, but it was a republic. But the Buddha was from one of the aristocratic clans. He would have had all of the privileges of the aristocracy. According to other suttas, his father had built for him 3 palaces, one for each season of the Indian year. He would live in the palace surrounded by dancing girls, musicians. He would have lotus gardens. Certainly he would be eating every day the most delicious food. No worries, no cares, no troubles. Then when he was 16 years old, he was married. And probably as a young man, he was still not satisfied with all of this, but he would always have been seeking more because that was the temperament of the Kshatriyas, the warrior class in India. But at some point, the Buddha then, the Bodhisattva, began to question himself and to ask, why, being myself subject to birth, do I also seek what is subject to birth, and so on. Then he says, suppose that I go out, now that I've seen the danger in what is subject to birth, let me go out to seek the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Okay, so this is the way the Buddha is reflecting. You know, in the legendary life of the Buddha, we have this told in the form of a legend that the Bodhisattva didn't even know that there was such a thing as old age, sickness, and death. But one day, out of curiosity, he wanted to see what life was like outside the palace. And so he asked his father, please let me travel outside the palace. His father cleared up the whole city, gave orders, get rid of all of the old people, no sick people, no funerals this day. And so when the Bodhisattva went out, there were all young, beautiful, happy people applauding him and cheering him. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, there appeared an old man walking on a stick, then a sick man lying on the side of the road, trembling and weeping, and then a funeral took place with a corpse being carried to the cremation ground. So that is, we call this the legend. It's a kind of external representation of what is really going on in the Bodhisattva's mind, which is reflecting deeply on the real facts of life, reflecting on birth, old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement. Okay, so then he says, a little sometime later, while still a young man in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the Nikaya, it's not really yellow, it's a kind of brownish orange robe, and I went forth from the home life into homelessness. Okay, during the Buddha's time, and probably going back even several hundred years earlier, it was the custom for those who wanted to realize truth, to achieve liberation from the cycle of birth and death, to leave the household life and take on the lifestyle of what is called a samana. The samana is an ascetic, a monastic person, a renunciant. And so when the Bodhisattva was a prince thinking about leaving the household life, or thinking about the problems of birth, old age, sickness, and death, he had a certain precedent or a model to follow, and that is to adopt the lifestyle of an ascetic. And so in the Buddha's time, there were ascetics who were living in the forest, sometimes alone, sometimes in communities. Some of them would just wear a loincloth, some would go completely naked, others would wear white robes, and others would wear, probably most of them would wear a kind of copper-colored saffron ochre robe. And so the Bodhisattva, following their example, shaved off his hair, beard, and then put on the yellow robe, the saffron robe, and entered the homeless life. And when one entered the homeless life, the usual path that one followed was to seek out a teacher. One would be looking for somebody who knows the way to wisdom, somebody who knows the way to enlightenment. And so probably after the Bodhisattva left the palace and became a wanderer, he would meet with fellow wanderers and ask, who are the wise teachers around? Who are the top-rated gurus of the day? And so people would make some recommendations to him, and one of the people that he must have heard high praise of in different circles was a man named Alara Kalama. Okay, so now the Bodhisattva comes to Alara Kalama and he says, I want to lead the holy life in this Dhamma and discipline. And it's interesting that the text uses this double expression here. In Pali, the word is Dhamma Vinaya. And this is the word that the Buddha applies most often to his own teaching. So what the Buddha himself teaches is a Dhamma, which is the doctrine. And then the word Vinaya has come to take on the meaning of the code of monastic rules. But actually probably the older, more original sense of Vinaya is the course of training, the course of practice. And so every teacher also during this period would have had his own Dhamma Vinaya. The Dhamma would have been some kind of philosophical doctrine which laid out kind of intellectual or conceptual structure around which the quest for enlightenment was arranged or organized. And then at the heart of his teaching, there would have been a course of training, which is not just observing rules and regulations, but it's a way of training every aspect of one's life, one's behavior, but also especially a way to train the mind through the practice of a meditative discipline. We don't know exactly what kind of doctrine and discipline Alara Kalama taught, but all we know is that he set up a certain meditative attainment as being the peak or high point of his system. Okay, so the Bodhisattva comes to Alara and says that he wants to lead the spiritual life, the holy life, in this Dhamma and Vinaya. Then Alara praises his own doctrine. He says this doctrine is such that a wise person can soon enter and dwell in it, realizing for himself through direct knowledge his own teacher's doctrine. In other words, here Alara, and I think this is an important point when we consider the later development of Indian spirituality, in which there's a lot of emphasis upon submitting to the Guru, surrendering to the Guru, venerating the Guru. At this time, from this we could see that Alara, just like the Buddha, is pointing out that the important thing is not himself as the person, but what's important is the teaching or his Dhamma. And he's also saying that I'm not the only one who has realized this, but any wise person who practices diligently can realize this same goal for himself. Okay, so the Bodhisattva says that he quickly learned this Dhamma, and then as far as recitation went, he was able to speak with knowledge and assurance about it, and to say, I know this, I understand this, so himself, and there were others too. And so it seems at first the Bodhisattva mastered the theory about Alara's teaching, but he wasn't satisfied with this. And so he thinks it's not through mere faith alone that Alara speaks about his doctrine, but he speaks on the basis of knowledge and insight. And so then the Bodhisattva comes to Alara and says, how do you speak, on what basis do you speak about entering and realizing this doctrine? And when the Bodhisattva asks this, Alara then explains to him what is called the base of nothingness. Okay, now the base, what is this base of nothingness? In the Buddha's own system of meditation, there are 8 stages of samadhi, 8 stages of deep concentration. The first 4 are the 4 jhanas. These are called simply the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. So those are stages in which the mind is becoming more and more collected, concentrated, focused, and absorbed into a state of deep peace and tranquility. But beyond the 4 jhanas, there are 4 other stages of samadhi, which are called the formless meditations. In Pali, these are called the arupa attainments. These are called arupa samapatti. That means the meditative attainments without any form as its object. The jhanas have some kind of visible form as their object, like a bright, beautiful, radiant light. But in the formless attainments, even that beautiful, bright light vanishes, and there is an absorption of the mind without any kind of visible form for the mind to latch onto. And so the 4 formless attainments, the lowest is called the base of infinite space. So all form drops away, and there's just left a kind of mental perception of the infinity of space. Then going beyond that comes the second level, which is called the base of infinite consciousness. So space drops away, the awareness of space drops away, and the mind focuses upon the infinite expanse of consciousness itself. In the third stage, even consciousness as an object drops away, and there remains what is called nothingness. It's a kind of state without any obstruction, any impediment, any kind of substantial object ahead of it, in front of it. Okay, so Alara Kalama was able to enter into that state called the base of nothingness. And apparently, he took the attainment of that state to be the attainment of liberation, the attainment of enlightenment. Okay, so the Bodhisattva reflected that he has all the qualities needed to realize that attainment. He has faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. And so he makes a determined effort to reach that meditative state. And so he quickly enters and dwells in that state, experiencing it for himself. He goes to his teacher, Alara, and reports what he has achieved. And then Alara doesn't get envious and resentful, but he congratulates the young Bodhisattva. Maybe Alara is an older man, maybe 55, 60 years old. Now that seems young to me. And the Bodhisattva is just 29 years old, maybe 30 years old. And yet the old master is overjoyed that his new disciple has realized this state. And so he says, it's a gain for us, a great gain, that we have you for such a companion in the holy life. The Dhamma that I say I enter upon and dwell in, that is the same Dhamma that you enter and dwell in. You know the Dhamma that I know the Dhamma that you know. You are just like myself, I am like you. And now, I'm at the bottom of page 257, he gives a very great honor to the Bodhisattva. He says, "Come, friend, let us now lead this community together." This means that he's making the Bodhisattva his co-teacher. So he's saying, now we're at an equal level as far as attainment, realization goes. So I won't be the exclusive teacher anymore, but we will be co-teachers of this group. Probably this was a tempting offer. It's like somebody in the business world says, okay, I'm the president of the company, and now I have some very capable young executive comes in to work for me. He shows himself to be very skilled, very capable, very diligent. And so after just even maybe a few months in the company, he proves himself to be so capable that I think he's just as good as I am. So instead of me being the president and he just being a subordinate, I say, come on, we will be co-presidents of the company. But probably you won't get that in the business world, because then they have to share the salary. Okay, so the Bodhisattva goes on, he says, now he's speaking to the monks, he says, "Thus Alara Kalama, my teacher, placed me, his pupil, on an equal footing with himself and awarded me the highest honor." But now the Bodhisattva, maybe he said to Alara, let me think about it for a while, not just accepting it once. But when he went off to reflect, then he thought to himself, this Dharma